Okay, today we're gonna show you guys how to adjust a trigger on the EVOL series of rifles. That's the EVOL Tactical, the 22, the 30, and then also the Woodstock Paradigm version. Both of these trigger assemblies are very similar. They adjust exactly the same. The only slight differences are how you remove the action from the stock. It's very simple, only requires a couple of tools. Nothing's difficult to do, and we'll show you how to do that. And the reason we want to do this for a couple of reasons. Trigger adjustment has to be done that way. You can also adjust the hammer tension when it's out of the chassis. Older guns will have the burst disc on the side, and to degas the gun, all you have to do is get your 3/8 wrench and turn that about 1/8 of a turn to the left, and it will leak out. It takes about 2-3 minutes. Newer guns will have the burst disc underneath the chassis, and that would be a reason that you'd have to remove it from the chassis. So first we'll remove the safety, and as we do is loosen this up. The safety's two pieces. It's a knob, and then it's a knob with a stud. So once the safety's out, we can remove the two bolts that hold the gun together. Oops. So that one there, and this one up front. Okay, once you have those two out, you just lift straight up, and out it is. So now we have a chassis, and we have the complete action. When you want to adjust the trigger, there's no reason to degas the gun, so you don't need to do that. If you want to adjust the hammer spring back here, there's no reason to degas the gun. If you're going to do any other kind of maintenance on the gun, we always suggest that you degas it, just to be safe. And other maintenance means removing the trigger, maybe taking the barrel off, messing around with any of the gauges, that kind of thing. Our trigger has 4 adjustments, and they're marked on the right hand side of the trigger. This says O for OverTravel, the number 2 for second stage, the number 1 for first stage, and the P for PreTravel. So OverTravel is how far the trigger will move after the sear breaks, after the gun fires. PreTravel is the position of the first stage, so if you don't like to have a lot of extra motion here, you can address PreTravel and remove some of that. First stage is the trigger weight on the first stage, how hard it is to pull, and the second stage is the trigger weight on the second stage. One thing to keep in mind is that first stage and second stage pull weights are connected to each other. So it's 1 plus 2 for your total trigger pull. So if I increase 1 and leave 2 alone, it will be increasing the first stage trigger pull, and it also will be increasing the second stage trigger pull. If I just want to increase the second stage, then you can just do 2 only, and that will leave number 1 the same, and as you pull back, you'll feel it when you pick up that second stage. But just bear in mind that if you adjust the first stage, whatever you add here is also added to the second stage. The actual adjustments are these set screws, and there's 2 on this side, and there's 2 on this side. You're going to need an L wrench, because with those straight wrench you won't be able to get it in here, at least on this side of the gun. All adjustments have a nylon locking element in there, so when you turn the screw there's going to be some stiffness to it. That's normal, and that prevents the need for using Loctite on them. You don't have to Loctite them in place. This little nylon pin will put friction on them. If you want to increase, you go in clockwise. If you want to decrease, you go out counterclockwise, just like a normal screw. Whenever you adjust a trigger on any gun, firearm, air gun, doesn't matter what it is, it's really helpful to understand how it works. Because if you don't understand the inner workings, you can get it out of whack and make it either not safe or not usable. And we want to avoid both of those things. So just a couple pitfalls to remember when you adjust your PreTravel on this gun, which is how far this first stage comes forward. If you should always have the safety on when you adjust the PreTravel. That will allow you to bring the trigger back until it bumps the safety mechanism inside. If the safety's not on, okay, so right now it's off, and you can see how far back this goes. Safety on, you can see it stops right there. If you adjust your PreTravel beyond the safety, you will not be able to put the safety on and off. It'll actually lock everything in place, which is not good. So the best way to adjust PreTravel is to put it on safe, which is all the way up, turn the screw in very lightly and just keep an eye on how it keeps moving back, moving back, moving back. And then if you feel it stop, you want to go back a half turn. You don't want it to be resting against the safety mechanism, because that'll cause the safety mechanism to malfunction. The other place you need to pay attention is when you adjust the OverTravel. Now the OverTravel stops the trigger right after the sear breaks, and if you turn this in too far, you will actually prevent the sear from breaking. You will stop the trigger and the sear from coming back, and it will never release. So on the OverTravel, what you want to do is get it to the point where it won't release, and then back it out until it releases reliably, if you want the minimum OverTravel of the trigger. Now, when we reassemble the gun, there's just a couple of things to be aware of. The safety, you want to make sure that this assembly is pushed together. There's a little spacer in here. There's a lever on each side. You want to make sure that they're all squeezed together. Sometimes they will pop apart when you're playing around with the adjustment, so squeeze it back together before you go to put it back in the chassis. So we're just going to drop the chassis straight down on the gun, squeeze it, put the bolt back in, and these don't need to be tightened to death, they just need to be snugged up, just like that. Take the front, just snug it up, that's all that's required. And the other last place to pay attention on reassembling the gun is the safety. When you put this together, you don't need to tighten it very tight. If you over tighten it, you can snap this stud. It's got a very large wrench socket in it for a relatively small piece of hardware, so just be careful when you put it back together. All you have to do is just thread it on until it stops, and then grab your wrench and just barely tighten it. Just give us a little, hold it with one side and just barely snug it. That's all that's required. If you crank it too tight, you can snap that stud. And whenever you reassemble a gun, you want to make sure that it's functioning properly. You want to test everything. So cocking, when you decock the EVOL, hold on to the handle, squeeze the trigger, and let it close. You try that with this, make sure the safety's functional. Make sure not gonna fire. Take it off safety. There you go. You always want to avoid pulling the trigger with it open, with the bolt, not holding onto the bolt, otherwise it'll snap closed. And when you're single loading this gun, just a little safety tip is if you're going to single load the EVOL, put it on safe, load your pellet, close your bolt, take it off safe. And the reason we do this is because if you have your finger in here, when you load it and you pull the trigger or whatever by accident, it's going to move the bolt forward and it's going to poke you. This is the EVOL Paradigm. It's the same basic platform as the TAC, EVOL, the TAC 30 and 22 and all the others. The differences are, obviously this is a wood stock and the safety mechanism a little different. Turn this around. This happens to be a left-handed gun, so I'll have the safety on the left-hand side. A right-handed gun would have the safety on the opposite side. To remove the action from this rifle is very similar to the TAC version. You have to remove the safety, which is just a screw. And in this case, the safety is not ambidextrous, it's just single-sided. And we remove it just by unscrewing that. To remove the action from the wood stock, we pull out this bolt right here. Once that's out, so once the retention bolt is removed, you can wiggle the gun out of the chassis. It's a pretty snug fit, so you have to just be real patient with it. Wiggle, 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 and out it comes. And then everything in terms of adjustment on the trigger is exactly the same as the TAC versions of the rifle. And this is an example of a burst disc on the bottom, which is put there for the wood stock guns. And if you need to degas your gun, this is where you would do it. This is your hammer adjustment right here. And it has a little drag screw, which you shouldn't need to adjust. It just puts a little drag on it so it doesn't move on its own. Put the wrench in there and turn it either in or out. And generally 1/8 inch increments is a good number to start with to see changes. Just want to talk a little bit about the tuning on the EVOL series guns. So at the factory, we spend a fair amount of time on the chronograph with each gun. And what we want to do is we want to send it to you in a way that it is functioning and shooting within the design parameters that it was intended to shoot in. So for a 30 caliber, for example, we're going to make sure it's shooting around 890 feet per second, which is about 78 foot-pounds. Perfect for the JSB 44 grain pellet that the gun was designed around. Also very good for the 50 grain pellet as well. It'll shoot down about 840. And those are really the sweet spots for that particular pellet. That's where you're going to find your best accuracy. That's where you're going to find your best efficiency. So that's where we're going to set the gun up from the factory. But if you want to make small adjustments to it, it's designed in such a way that you have a range of adjustment with the regulator set at the factory setting. So on a 30 cal, we'll set our regulator up. On a 30 cal, we'll set our regulator up at 1950 psi, and that'll allow you to adjust between 900 down to 800 feet per second, and still be within the efficiency and the design parameters of the hammer and spring system. So if you want to change just a few feet per second, all you need to do is adjust your hammer spring. Eighth of a turn, 16th of a turn is generally enough to give you 3, 4, 5 feet per second at a time. Recommend that you do it from a full fill, that you make your adjustment, you shoot 2 or 3 pellets across the chrony, and then go for your actual number. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 shots to actually see your change kind of normalize, and that's normal. So don't expect to turn it, shoot it, turn it, shoot it to get to your target. You want to turn it, shoot it a few times, and then see where it's at before you move on with further adjustment. We design guns for specific purposes. So for example, the EVOL 30 was designed to be basically around the JSB 44 and 50 grain pellet. The idea is to make it as accurate, as precise, and as repeatable as possible. So this particular gun, although it does have the capability to shoot slugs, and a little bit later I'll talk about, what the benefits might be for that for some people. But bear in mind that you want to buy the gun that was designed for the task that you actually are interested in. So the 30 cal gun here is really designed around the 44 grain pellet. And I'll say pellet weight slugs. And when I say pellet weight slugs, I'm talking about slugs that are in the same weight range as the pellets that are commercially available. So with this EVOL 30, for example, with a 44 grain pellet, you can generally adjust the hammer spring up to get 910, 905, 910 feet per second. That's kind of the max that you'll get out of this gun with the regulator at the factory setting, which is 1950 psi. But you will find that that 44 grain pellet is going to perform much more accurately around 865, 870 in that range, because at over 900 feet per second, the drag on that pellet is so high that it's really susceptible to the wind. So as your drag goes up, your wind drift goes up. It's a linear relationship. So what you want to do is you want to keep the pellet out of the high drag range, and that is under 900 feet per second for a 30 caliber pellet. So if you're shooting for accuracy, you want to be 865, 870, maybe 880. And I know you'll hear, oh, I want to shoot 905 or I want it 900. It's going to have better trajectory. That's not really true. Yes, it will have a better trajectory, but it is so infinitesimally better that you won't even be able to notice it. I mean, we're talking at 100 yards, you're probably looking at 50 thousandths of an inch difference between 905 and say 880. And the reason for this is all that extra energy you put into it, when the pellet leaves the muzzle at that velocity, the drag is so high that you're burning all that energy off in the first few feet. So when it gets out to 100 yards, you've already lost a lot of that energy. So it just makes more sense to use it where it's designed to be used and where the physics tell you that it's going to work the best. And that's the way the gun's tuned from the factory, and that's why we get really good results right out of the box. Well, I hope I was able to clearly explain some of the features of our guns, how you make adjustments to them, and we'll be making more of these videos in the future.